Hey, this month I played this Crystal Wisp control deck to S rank. It took me about 65 wins. I played it all the way from about rank 3 or 4 to S, and before that, I sprinkled in some other decks. I got the decks from Styx, and I did a video about it last month, and I've changed a lot of cards around. I've definitely played with the top end, and I'm definitely not finished tweaking it. And I just really wanted to let people know about this deck because I think it's actually pretty powerful. I got to play against some pretty talented players, and I was able to do fairly well and get to S rank fairly quickly, even though I'm not a particularly high level tournament player or a proficient ladder grinder most of the time. So the deck is based around Crystal Wisp, and it's a 1/1 minion for 2 mana that when it dies gives you an extra mana crystal. And that's a permanent mana crystal. It will still cap out at 9 like normal, but on every turn you'll have, an extra mana all the way up till you hit 9. So what you want to do is you want to use that acceleration to play high value minions and use the cheap removal from Vanna to gain tempo while developing your minions at the same time and controlling the board. And then you usually have a surprising amount of burst damage with which to just rapidly finish your opponent off. Between your Bloodborne spell from Fae, Chromatic Holds, Aspect of the Mountain, Aspect of the Fox to get transforms to do more damage, you have a surprising ability to burst your opponent down. So, just starting off with the low drops, we have Crystal Cloaker and Healing Mystic. Those are just to lay down and try to secure mana crystals. You're usually going to be replacing these late. They're not overly useful, but you do want some 2-drops to supplement the Crystal Wisps in this deck, because you don't want to fall too far behind on board, because you're very much a 1 spell, or a 1 minion per turn deck, and maybe a 1 minion plus a removal spell. So if your opponent is able to get 3 or 4 minions down, and they're out of Frostburn range, you're in trouble. So you want to control the board early and not let it get out of control. So that's what these allow you to do. And the deck could use a little more healing. It might show off some matchups, so you could replace the Crystal Cloakers with something like Azure Herald, or just change the numbers of Healing Mystics as well. Crystal Wisp is the namesake of the deck. It's your acceleration. Your opponent usually won't kill it, so you usually have to kill it on your turn. It can still be used to trade into 2/3s and kill them off with your general. So the body isn't irrelevant. It's definitely small. It also can be turned into a fox or a seismic elemental using Aspect of the Mountain. So the body isn't, completely irrelevant, but it is very small and definitely overpriced. Hurt Sister is probably the most important card in the deck outside of Crystal Wisp. This sets up Dancing Blades. Can it set up a Dancing Blade? Yes, it can set up a Dancing Blade. It can set up for Bone Reapers. It can get your large minions into combat because you're otherwise a little bit immobile. It can set you up to get big seismic elemental plays. It can set up your Bloodborne spell. It does so many things. It can just protect you by sending a minion off to a corner. It does so many things, and it's so versatile, and learning how to use this is really key to playing, I think, any Vanna deck. Any Vanna deck generally includes these, and they're very, very important. Next up, Chaos Elemental. Chaos Elemental is just a big body. You could put all kinds of things at this 3 spot, and I think you'd do fine. The benefit of Chaos Elemental is that it's very good at controlling the game, controlling the board early, which is something that we need to do. It takes a spell to remove, or a hit from the general, and since this deck does finish off quickly, the general damage isn't bad, and the unpredictability of the RNG also affects your opponent. They can't just take a swing at it and not account for the fact that it may get to attack a minion on your turn that they weren't expecting. So it's a pretty powerful 3-drop, and I think it works well in the deck, even though this deck is often trying to skip the 3-drop. So that's why we only play 2 3-drops. That's our, other than 1s, it's our lowest number. And you could change this out, definitely, but I think Chaos Elemental is in a pretty good spot here. The Lotus is something that I considered changing out, but the 5/3 body is a great size. It does a lot of damage, it can help control the board, and having the O10 Tombstone when it dies really helps you transition into your late game. In the games where you don't get to accelerate, having those extra turns for you to be able to play your bigger minions becomes hugely beneficial. So I was very happy having some in the deck. I think maybe going down to 2 and freeing up another spot for another tech card or another bigger minion might be the right answer. But the Lotus is very much for controlling the board in the mid game and buying you some time. Night Watcher is a tech card who is entirely meant for the Magma matchup, but is also very good against Vitruvian, which I saw very little of. But it's very, very good against Dervishes. They don't have a very good answer at all. If you just place it in a protected spot, it's very, very hard for them to do anything about it at all. Even their answers would be something like a third wish, which is hard to get off if you just keep their other dervishes clear, and all their wind dervishes will not have rush, so they will just not be able to utilize that. I played it mostly for Magma. I was having a lot of trouble with people chaining rush minions because the deck is meant to destroy an enemy minion and develop your own minion in a turn. You accelerate your mana so you can fit in these 1 to 2 mana removal spells as well as fit in your own minion. Even something like a Hailstorm Prism is very good if you then play down a minion because it allows you to seize the board and take control of the tempo of the game. So, rush minions allow your opponent to circumvent that entire defensive strategy and makes it very hard for you to control the amount of damage your general's taken. And this deck is vulnerable to being just rushed down by aggressive decks. So Night Watcher was an inclusion to prevent that, and I actually didn't run into any Magma decks after I made that switch. It was mainly in the rank 2 to S rank that I made that change, and it didn't actually ended up benefiting me too much, but I think Night Watcher is a very good card, and I might swap out something like a Delotus for that. Sworn Sister was a great card draw for me. I ended up replacing the cards most of the time, but Vanna has some very good spells, and they have a lot of removal, which is nice because getting redundancy in those random spells allows you to have a little bit more consistency. You could put in something like a Spelljammer, because this deck is, in a lot of ways, a tempo deck, but it also has the ability to kind of attrition out the enemy board with your bigger minions. So the Spelljammers were sometimes giving my opponent too many cards, and giving faster decks too many cards early on in the game, and I wasn't a fan of that. So that's the other option. If you were to change out the Chaos Elementals for like something like a Sojourner, maybe you could move in the direction of putting just utility minions in this 4 slot rather than having any kind of card draw. Dancing Blades. Dancing Blades is something I might want to add a third of, because Dancing Blades is pretty much the prototypical play that steals control of the board and regains the tempo after this deck makes its transition from behind in tempo when you're playing understated minions like just a Healing Mystic or a Crystal Wisp, to the mid game when you've got that mana acceleration and you're able to start destroying your opponent's minions and becoming the aggressor. So Dancing Blades is just hugely powerful against so many decks in the meta. There's a lot of small minions running around, and between Hearth Sister and your general attack and your Bloodborne spell, you're able to kill some of the larger minions as well. And even if you take some damage, once you have control of the board, this deck is very good at keeping it. Next up is Fossiva. I wanted a minion that if I laid down on an empty board, something like a Dancing Blades isn't very good on an empty board. It's just a 4/6 body, which is nothing poor, but it's, sort of 4 mana's worth of stats, with the Hailstone Golem, which is a decent card but doesn't see play. I wanted something that I could lay down on the board, and it would be hard for my opponent if they weren't a deck that had spells, spell destruction, which a lot of decks don't really have a ton of. Something like Agion would not have a ton unless they're playing Circle of Life. Even a Holy Immolation would require an attack, which would give me a little Night Howler. So I wanted something that would come down, and it's definitely vulnerable to Dispel, but so many cards in this deck are that you can often draw them out, and I found it to be relatively effective. It is pretty terrible if you're behind because the body is just pretty small and your opponent can just kind of ignore it and just go for your general space if that's what their strategy is. So this is a deck that a card that's definitely a metagame slot, as are pretty much all of the top end of this deck. All of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minions that we use as finishers. Next up is Hollow Grovekeeper, and I put this in with the intention of destroying Lionar decks, and I actually didn't really run into too many of those, and when I did, I had so many tools to beat them that I'm not even sure if the Grove Keepers are necessary, but it is hugely powerful against something like an Iron Cliff, and because this deck accelerates so well, it often has the ability to completely take over the board because it comes down at a time when its body is still really relevant, in addition to the destroy effect. So, I kept one in, and I wasn't unhappy with it, but again, completely dependent on the metagame. Next up, Bone Reaper. This was something for a more aggro metagame, which I wasn't running into too much, but would occasionally help against some of the more aggressive decks, something like Lionar Tempo, something like some of the Riva decks, and play more small minions. I didn't run into many Starhorn decks, or Lilith decks that might have been good against the Swarm. So it's good at just adding 2 damage at the end of turn, in addition with your General, or a Bloodborne spell, or a Dancing Blades, or any number of things to finish off minions, and it doesn't lose any health to do so. So it's very, very powerful in that regard, and it's also a 9 health Provoke minion, which is quite a bit of health, and if you can play it and have it not get dispelled, it's a good way to slow down the game and allow you to continue laying down even larger minions. It got dispelled pretty often, but a 2/9 isn't the worst minion in the world, and it's still able to help contribute to board control. Next up is the Dragar Lord, I believe it's pronounced. And again, I wanted something that if I lay down an empty board would help me finish the game, and I think this did that pretty effectively. It's very good at keeping the board once you have it. It's slow, so you don't generally want to play it into a big enemy board, but it does have the benefit that if your opponent's forced to deal with it because of positioning, you'll get another one, another 4/8 in that same position, and that might help you keep control of the board because it's very difficult for your opponents to deal 16 points of damage to destroy both of them in one turn. So, again, this was a card I was very happy with. I switched to it rather late because I was trying to use mostly neutral minions in these slots, and then I decided that I would try out what Vanna has to offer. These are mostly confined to Vesper decks that get them off Vesper Call, but I tried them out and I was actually surprisingly happy with them, and I think the difference between this deck and a lot of other decks is that the acceleration allows them to come down at a time when their bodies line up better with the things your opponent will be playing. If it gets to a certain point in the game, the 4 attack isn't enough to swing the game quickly. Next up is the Ancient Grove. And I was a little skeptical of this actually because I didn't think I was playing that many minions, but I realized that 28 is actually a fairly large number, and I could often have 1 or 2 minions on the board when this came down, which meant I was getting a couple extra provokes, and it's also just an enormous provoke minion. And since I was having trouble with the Magma, I wanted something that would force a Macantor to suicide on, which is why I chose to go with this instead of, I was talking to Cybon, and he suggested playing something like a Primus Shieldmaster. So this is kind of another anti-Magma tech that was also just a big finisher to complement supplement maybe, the Dark Nemesis and Pandora. You'll notice that quite a few cards in this deck end up dying to Plasma Storm, so I wanted to have a mix of finishers so that I wasn't weak to that with just all the Pandoras. Next up is Dark Nemesis, and Dark Nemesis is the original finisher that Styx was playing, and it's definitely a very powerful minion. It's a little bit vulnerable to silence because it doesn't get immediate value. You have to wait till your turn cycle to go. The benefit of this in this deck, or benefit of that, choice of finisher in this deck, is that you can place it in a safe position and then swap it in with the Hearth Sister. Or you can just place it in a safe position and stall out and just take the 4 damage plus your Bloodborne spell every turn. 6 damage will end the game very, very quickly if you can just use your spells to continue to stall. So, lastly we have Pandora, which is just kind of a reaction to the issues I was having with Dark Nemesis, where it was getting dispelled right away. And Pandora, the weakness, of course, is that it does die to the Plasma Storm, and so do all the wolves. I believe they're wolves. They may be foxes. The things that it summons. But it summons them at the end of turn, so you immediately get one. So even if it's silenced or dispelled, you will have a 3/10 plus a wolf or fox with a random ability. So you have a decent amount of value even in that case. So that's the deck, and it looks messy. It has a lot of text slots. The core of the deck is really just the crystal wisps and then the spell package, excluding the aspect of the mountain, which is another text slot, which is something that I ended up using a lot, and I ended up using a lot to finish off my opponents with a surprise boost in damage by turning a low attack minion into a 5/5, even sometimes a tombstone into a 5/5, dealing an extra 5 damage, and it was very powerful. So those are the core of the deck, really the aspect of the Fox, Chromatic Cold, Hailstone Prism, Frostburn, and then the Hearth Sisters and Crystal Wisps. Those are why you play the deck. And the rest of the cards are just helping fill out your curve with efficient minions that take control of the board. So I had some great games. I want to show you guys, and I'm going to have a whole written guide as well. So thank you for watching. I know this was a long video, but I appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you.